Well, we've had a number of questions come in during that time. I'm going to do my best to keep a watch on what's been coming through, as well as do keep them coming in the chat. So I think we're going to get everyone up on the screen, yeah? And I think we'll start this off by a question which perhaps unfairly is coming from me, but I think we'll open up the conversation a little bit. I just wondered from each of you, what has been maybe or maybe there hasn't been, but have there been any Christian scientists that actually have really been similar to what you were saying, Dave, with Tom McLeish, who've really inspired you or walked alongside you, who you've perhaps wanted to kind of learn from? And perhaps we'll start with you, John, and go through the order of the day.
There we go. Difficult really, because I would say at the time I was a student was a time of quite significant social upheaval. It was the kind of summer of love and the hippies and everything, so a lot was happening. Ideas were being tossed around up in the air, but I think for me, Donald Mackay, the neuroscientist, was very influential, and then maybe later Sam Berry, the geneticist, and going through then to John Polkinghorne. John Polkinghorne was a physicist when I was a PhD student, and really destined for stardom. A fellow of the Royal Society in his 30s, and gave it up to become a priest. So I think those three were really quite influential. My PhD supervisor called Polkinghorne a real saint, which is interesting. His faith was clearly well known. So yeah, I'll go for those three: Mackay, Berry, and Polkinghorne.
Cara. In all honesty, throughout my degree, I didn't really have a figure like that. I didn't have any Christians in my science circles that I knew of, and any scientists in my Christian circles. So I had quite a lonely road. So the person who kind of felt like they first gave me this hug and said it'll be okay was actually Francis Collins. And it's not because I met him, it's just through his books and his story. So I have yet to meet him, but for me, that was a very freeing moment. Yeah.
He's lovely, Cara.
Yes, I think he is.
Fantastic. Nathan.
Yeah, I'm going to cheat a bit, and because I'm not a scientist, I'm going to talk about historians instead. Although I do have a scientist that I would select as well, but historians-wise, Peter Harrison is certainly the first one, just because he's so well known as one of the kind of pioneers in the field of kind of science and Christianity. And one of the first people to kind of start changing the narrative of conflict between science and Christianity, and show how those Christian considerations, as Dave spoke about, really underpin the foundations of modern science. And then the other person I would say is actually Peter Harrison's student called James Ungurianu, who I'm not entirely sure he's spoken with CiS, but again, Dave has also written a book with James. That's his most recent book, of Popes and Unicorns. And it's another excellent work. And I think those guys have been quite inspiring for me, precisely because they're historians, but also Christians in this space. And there's not many, I would say, that are kind of historians that are also Christians. And so to come across a few is somewhat rare, but very needed and quite inspirational for me.
All right, Zachary.
Yeah, as an undergrad back in New Zealand, everyone in my department seemed to be an atheist. So they definitely came through in lectures, and there was no public Christian, but there was a couple of academics in other departments, one in medicine, one in engineering, who were quite public Christians. And that was quite encouraging to see that was possible in kind of adjacent fields. They're both kind of science related, doing biology related work. But in biology itself, just the culture was so anti-Christian. I think that there may have been one or two Christians, but just no one was willing to be public about that. Just an anecdote about Tom McLeish. I only met him once at a conference, but I was really encouraged that he was just in the breaks, he seemed to always be giving copies of his books away and talking with people. And I just found it super encouraging that Faith the Royal Society, who's running the conference I was at, was kind of engaged in personal evangelism. Obviously, with the things he was talking about with his secular colleagues. That was really encouraging that that people are doing this. Yep.
Right, and Dave.
I think it's Cara next, isn't it?
No.
Oh, no, did Cara already go?
Yeah.
Oh, all right. Sorry. My apologies, everyone. I guess. So, I guess Tom is the obvious one, and then also David Wilkinson at Durham.
Oh yeah.
And he has a PhD in astrophysics and a PhD in theology. I mean, the guy's found the way of not having to do any work, hasn't he? Really, basically. And so I think it's a community. A lot of the time, I don't think it's a particular individual. I think it's a community. And there are times in your Christian faith where you wobble and you think, hang on, am I insane? Like, do I really believe any of this stuff, really? And in those moments, sometimes you rely on the faith of others. You can't live a whole Christian life on the faith of other people, but you can live it for a few weeks or a few months, where you can be like, well, look, I'm having a wobble, but I know that Cara believes it, or I know Nathan believes it. And so that can be a huge encouragement, because you think, right, I know this person, they're genuine, they're loving, they're intelligent, they're committed, they're going for it. That's enough for me right now. And it just gets you through that little gap. And it's a little bit like the verse in Ecclesiastes that says, if one falls, another can pick them up. And I think that's just what we've got to do as a community. We've got to do that for each other. There'll be times when you are on fire for God and someone else isn't, and actually you're carrying them through. And then there'll be times when that's reversed. So that'll be a general observation, I suppose.
Great. Well, perhaps we'll have to try and, group all those different people together and, make sure that everyone can know about them and look up them afterwards. But that was really interesting. Thanks, guys. So yeah, please do feel free to keep putting questions in the chat and the Slido. I've got a couple here. So this question says, do you have any advice or experience on how to disagree well with other scientific colleagues, Christian and otherwise? So do chime in if you've got something you'd like to say.
I wonder what sort of areas of disagreement are envisaged here. I think what I notice in the bioethical area is that there is, for example, a range of thinking about the moral status of the early human embryo. And should we regard the early human embryo pre-implantation, that pre-pregnancy phase, which is manipulated in IVF, should we regard that as a human person? And there are a range of views on that. And I have a close friend, and it's a good job we're friends, because we disagree quite markedly. I have quite a biological view, and her social, her ethical view is very different from my bioethical view, which is it's a very conservative end. But we just have to say, well, that this is how we think differently on this, and we're just going to have to go with it, because it should not spoil our fellowship. I think you've actually got to come down to that at some point. And I guess also, if you don't know your protagonist very well, then you can do that at a slightly more distant level. Well, thank you, Dr. X, but there are differing views on this. The Bible doesn't give us any direct direction, and we've got to work it out for ourselves in the way that Cara talked about. Christian ethics is really kind of boils down to principles and virtue, and we will interpret those principles in different ways sometimes. But let's just carry on being friends.
I just endorsed that I love the phrase disagreeing well, because I think when we go into schools, it's almost like tolerance is a great thing, but it's almost that gets you so much that you're not allowed to kind of have a conversation about differences in kind of a respectful way. So isn't it a great opportunity for us to model what that actually looks like disagreeing with people respectfully, lovingly, and saying we're all trying to do the best thing here. Let's put our heads together. And I think, yeah, I wonder if that's a skill we've lost. I don't know if it's social media or what it is, but I love the phrase disagreeing well.
Yeah, I might add to that as well, considering this theme. I like that very much, disagreeing well. One of the things I think I tend to put in place to an extent, because obviously a lot of engagement happens now on social media, I have it in my mind that if I do engage in some sort of a debate, let's say with somebody, that after that conversation, we would still be able to remain as friends, in the sense that we would still be able to go out and have like, a coffee or something and talk about other things normally. So that debate isn't the be all or end all of the conversation, because if that's the case, then it's almost just point scoring, because you want to actually be building relationships with people. That's the key thing about any of these kind of debates and discussions. And when it turns into an argument, when you're just throwing kind of name calling and you get to that level, then I almost think that the argument is already lost. And so that's sort of my guiding principle. It's not always completely effective, but at least that's kind of what I try to do. And and I try to kind of base that on biblical principles as well.
I guess.
Sorry, Zach, after you.
Sorry. Yeah, I guess my 2 cents is I think it's very hard to do it well. But one thing that's difficult is when sometimes Christians who are scientists will say different things in different audiences. So in a more technical audience, they'll admit that some scientific things that they won't admit when they're talking before Christian audiences. So that's just something I find really frustrating. So I think somewhere there has to be a place for disagreement, that we can't smooth over all. And I think that's the hard question is, what is that place? Because I think in Christian circles, there is more of a tendency to smooth over difference, or to ignore difference, and that kind of lets people get away with saying things that they shouldn't really be able to say. The other side is to be too antagonistic, and people can also do that. But I think there has to be some kind of middle ground where we can actually disagree with each other, because a lot of Christians say stuff that's just wrong, and they don't say it when other people with PhDs are there to challenge them, for instance. So that's just I'm curious if other people have comments on that, or because it does it can undermine things that we might want to say if there's one person who's going against that, or being contrarian. It can make things difficult.
Actually, if it just helps to follow on from that, I remember Francis Collins at our last summer course actually talking about their communication around COVID, and how obviously in scientific circles there would have been more discussion about uncertainty, probabilities, and stuff like that, but they were so scared when talking to the public, or so motivated when talking to the public to get them on board, that they didn't really talk about those sorts of things. And so maybe the public doesn't hear words like uncertainty or probability from scientists, but they'll do that behind closed doors, but not really to the public. Maybe that's an example of that.
The other thing I've come across is very, very strong reactions from those that oppose views. So in a debate about genetically modified crops, I was actually publicly called the Antichrist by somebody who was really sincere about their Christian faith and the wickedness of adding genes to crops. He actually called me the Antichrist in a lecture theatre at Exeter University. Quite hard to react to that with Christian charity. And then another occasion when David Wilkinson and I and a Methodist minister were running an event in Torquay, and the next day I had an email because of my supportability. Email asked me why I was doing the work of the devil. And so sometimes it's quite hard to be calm in the face of such reactions. One does one's best to act with God's grace.
I was once told that the reason that I didn't have the gift of tongues was because I was studying physics.
Oh, good grief.
So I do think we've got to be really careful here, because what can happen is, I agree with Zach. I just think that sometimes disagreement, it matters what you're disagreeing about. And there are times when disagreement is important enough to actually challenge the other person, properly challenge them. And the example that comes to my mind is Paul challenging Peter when they're in Jerusalem, when they come from Jerusalem, and Peter suddenly stops eating with all the Gentiles and goes and eats with the Jews. Now, what Paul could have done is just quietly call Peter to one side after the meal so that no one else knew about it, and just say, like, come on, this isn't good. But he actually made a decision to challenge Peter publicly because he could see what was at stake, right? And so it depends what the disagreement is about. And if the disagreement is at the level where it could be a genuine stumbling block, like it could actually damage the faith of others, then sometimes there are times, I think, where you have to take a bit of a stand and say that this isn't right. And in our area of Christianity and science, I would say that perhaps it is getting to that point with some, and I do not mean all, with some of the people who are advocating six-day creationism, and doing it in, so someone like, say, Ken Ham, who's doing it in a way that says, if you do not believe this, then you are not a Christian.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that it's getting to the point where there has to be like a public denunciation of that, and that's the right thing to do. I wouldn't apply that across the board, because I do think there are really gentle, thoughtful, careful Christian believers who do argue for six-day creation. They're trying to do it using science. They're trying to do it using the Bible. They're being gentle. They're being kind. That there is a real attempt to bring people together. And they would not say that if someone doesn't believe it, then they're not a Christian, right? They're not making it like an article of the faith. But I do think Zach's right. I think there are times when actually a public challenge is the right thing to do. But I had a very wise piece of advice when I first was going into church leadership, and that was, if you want to encourage someone, if you think God might be telling you to encourage someone, then go for it. But if you think God might be telling you to challenge someone, pray about it for 2 weeks every day before you say anything. And I think that's very wise advice.
Thanks so much, guys.
I love it.
Yeah. This question is perhaps, we'll start with Cara, and then if anyone else wants to add to it, they'd be more than welcome to. They've said, do you have any advice or experience on how to stay positive in the midst of climate change? I can find myself struggling with climate anxiety.
Oh, it's such a good question, because it's such a real thing. And I think for a while it was kind of acknowledged to be a real thing amongst climate scientists and conservation scientists. But actually now I think it's rolled out. And definitely if you speak to the youth, there's such high levels of climate anxiety in the general public that I think we really do need to talk about it. We need to share stories of how we cope when we face things that are difficult, when we face failures or things that feel bigger than us. And actually as Christians, maybe we have a lot to say to this, and a rich kind of history of encouraging people to fight a good fight, even though it may in the local or the short term feel like it's failing. So I think this is actually somewhere where we can have a real hopeful kind of message. I would also say to ask conservation scientists what they do, or Christian conservation scientists, because they're kind of facing this on a daily battle, and this will be part of their prayers and what they're going through, and they'll have learned lessons. So it'd be nice to share in that with them and see what they can tell us that would help us. But yeah, it's a really big area, I think.
Does anyone else want to add to that, or
I think we're with you there, Cara.
we're in agreement?
Yeah.
Great. This question says, there seems to be increasing elitism in science. It is interesting that you each talked about humility at some stage of your talk. Any more tips on how we maybe combat elitism or foster humility in our work?
Having run the science department, it's like rounding up cats. I think the problem is that the system by which science is run and financed in this country encourages competition. And to me, you know, science isn't the Olympics. We ought to be all working on this jigsaw puzzle together. And if it so happens that the only bit I put in is a bit of the blue sky and I didn't get the rudder of the galleon, well, that shouldn't matter. And yet, you know, we have a competitive system for grants. We have a competitive system for how well your papers are regarded with the impact factors. And I think the system militates against humility, and it's quite hard to retain humility when, if you do get a highly lauded paper, which is, you know, happens to many of us by luck, you know, I think you've got to work hard on retaining Christian grace and saying, okay, well, we were fortunate here. We were really fortunate. We just happened to arrive at that problem at the right moment. The techniques were available. So I think there really is a question of cultivating virtue as one of the as part of our Christian ethics. Actually cultivating that attitude in ourselves. If we catch ourselves out being overproud, and I think something, and I think Dave sort of alluded to that in passing, and thinking about Tom McLeish. I think we sometimes do need to work on our virtues, and not. If we catch ourselves being overproud, I think we've got to kick ourselves and say, come on, this is not quite good enough. And just pray for God's grace. That's all I can say, I think.
One thing I think is that if we have any expertise, it's very narrow, and it's very easy to forget that. And yeah, every scientist or academic who has some expertise, it's incredibly narrow, and I think that helps with humility once we realize that. If we're only among peers who work on exactly the same thing, then it's easier to forget that. But I think if we're intellectually curious about, you know, the history of science, philosophy of science, other kinds of things, we soon realize that there's so much we don't know, and that's and if we're speaking in public, it's hard. It's easy to forget to do this, but I think we need to clarify that as well. What are we an expert on, or what are we just talking as a general public scientist on?
I like to remember the words Karl Popper, knowledge is finite, ignorance is infinite.
I suspect Nathan might chip in after me, because I think there's lessons from history here. And so one of the things that I do in my lessons is, when I teach about an idea, I also teach the history of all the previous ideas.
Nice.
And that can be really helpful, because once you've shown someone that we were wrong about it 10 times already, they understand that we should hold things a little bit more loosely when you tell them what the current theory is. Whereas I think a lot of teachers teach science where they say, well, this is how it is. This is just a fact. Whereas my dad, when he was at school, he was taught a different thing to me. You know, my dad was taught that the solar system formed by the sun whizzing around, and as it whizzed around, little bits of it dropped off and solidified into planets. You know, he was taught that at school as a fact. So I think, well, I'll hand over to Nathan, but I think having history in mind is a really, really useful way of combating humility. because scientists, the history of science is a history of being wrong, really.
Yeah, kind of passed on the baton to me. But no, I would completely agree. I mean, it's interesting. Even, you know, most people today would probably still take Newtonian mechanics to be the correct system to kind of explain the world. But, you know, scientists obviously know that relativity is perhaps more accurate. But even with that, there are issues with relativity theory and quantum mechanics, and how to actually fit those together. And so even with our current theories, there are problems. But yeah, certainly you can go through the history of science, and just, you know, about 200 years ago, the ether theory was believed to be true about the universe. People believed that there was some sort of substance in the world that was it enabled various things, but communication as one thing. It was a way of it was a medium, in the same way like air is a sort of a medium. And, you know, that was dropped at some point within the last kind of 100 to 200 years. So certainly the other thing then I probably would add to that is that from a Christian perspective, it is also interesting what's happened historically. Up until the 19th century, theology was known as the queen of the sciences, essentially. This is the idea that science was not an end in itself. This is kind of limiting it to Europe in particular. But this was kind of well accepted from the kind of Middle Ages, time of Augustine upwards up until the 19th century. This was kind of the accepted kind of position of kind of Christians working in science, or just Europe generally speaking. And that transition kind of took place where science became the queen of everything, essentially, in sort of the 19th century. And arguably that's kind of what we're living in now. And so that kind of angle of humility, yeah, when you take a historical perspective, I think it's useful to kind of know that in a sense that was there. In a sense, it wasn't perfect, certainly, but that was a useful way of kind of dealing with it, in a sense of many scientists in the past realized that science was not an end in itself. The end was the glory of God, essentially. But with the transition to science being the queen of all knowledge, science has become an end in itself, and having ultimate scientific knowledge is the ultimate prize now. And so if you have that, as John said, in a very capitalist society, I think, which kind of just adds to that, then you've got everything. But taking a historical perspective, you can see that that's not always been the case. It's a contingent factor, again, a very Western contingent factor as well.
A really quick thought from me. I just wonder if kind of scientific humility is more present in the sciences more than the public thinks. As a scientist, you kind of are more aware of all the things you don't know. But I suppose when you're asked to talk about science, you present the things you know or are more certain about. But I think of all people, scientists should have a higher level of scientific humility, because every question comes with every answer comes with new questions. So maybe we just need to talk about all the things we don't know as well.
Great. Well, I think there was this idea that began to be teased out, particularly Zachary, you mentioned it, about being specialized, and maybe this increase of, you know, a lot of us doing a similar thing. And I suppose this is what this question's sort of coming at, is they've said, I'm impressed by the breadth of interests on show, particularly Dave and Nathan, who appear to be more like the classical polymaths you might have got. Why do you think we see less of these types of people? And any advice on how to keep up with different fields when we become so exhausted with information in today's culture?
Great question.
I can start on that and let anybody else kind of take over, just again from a historical perspective. I mean, again, from a historical perspective, talking about polymaths and a breadth of knowledge, again, up until the 19th century, polymathy was much more normal. Actually, my PhD was on a polymath, so that's quite interesting. From the 19th century onwards, with kind of developments in various branches of science, it's really when science, in its very modern sense, took off. A lot of the branches of science were established, lots more scientific communities. That's really the period when you see what's known as scientific specialism in the scientific world. And so from the 19th century up into the 20th century, polymaths were more and more ridiculed, and it was more profitable to be a specialist in a particular subject. And so that's kind of where things are, have been. And that's part of that is because science has become government funded. It wasn't government funded in the past, historically speaking. Science was much more of a personal vocation, something that somebody did on the side where they did their kind of proper career, let's say as a theologian or as a lawyer. And then when they had the time, they would practice science. But as science became a profession during this period, that's when more knowledge kind of developed and more specialisms occurred. And so really, it's only really been the last, again, 100 or so years that this kind of notion of specialism has become a thing. And with that, I think what has happened now with fields is that I think this term interdisciplinary has become a kind of new way of dealing with too much knowledge. The problem with interdisciplinary is that it's still kind of very academic. So because one person can't learn everything, what you do is you work with other people in their specialisms to develop kind of new knowledge. And I think that's what's being pushed now. So in the past, polymaths were very normal. And then you get this age of specialism. And now we're kind of getting to this age where, because of specialism, different fields are working together. The problem then is, how do you kind of get to kind of know about all of this knowledge if you're interested in a particular subject? I'm not sure, because it's extremely challenging. Even as I think everybody here can agree with me that even in your own field, you know very little. None of us are specialists in the entirety of science. I'm not a specialist in the history of science. I'm just a specialist in a very small subsect of that. And so even for us as academics, it's very challenging. So I haven't got any good answers for that. I hope somebody else has better answers.
It is possible, though. I think, Tom McLeish, that we've talked about with great respect, I think he was approaching a polymath, wasn't he? Because he applied his physics in the end to biology, and he was also great on music and the arts. And I think, if we're looking at younger scientists, I think Ard Louis at Oxford approaches that sort of Tom McLeish sort of level. So it sort of depends on personality as well. I think some people want to be more focused, and others, I think, want to keep their options open. So it's not necessarily a criticism to say somebody's focused, but I think also we recognize the brilliance of some of these people who are able to keep tabs on 2 or 3 fields at once and be very normal as people as well. I was once told by a head of department that I would never make it as a scientist because I devoted too much of my time to athletics, which I found a way of releasing the tensions of running a lab.
Yeah, you do sometimes get so when I teach about, say, Thomas Young, they learn about the Young modulus in A-level physics.
Oh yes. Yeah.
And then they learn about the Young slits in quantum mechanics, and then they learn about him deciphering hieroglyphics in history. And you think, how does one person do all of that? But I think there are some simple answers. One is, there was no internet, right?
No Netflix.
There were no PlayStations, no Xbox, no Netflix, and sometimes these people were, like Nathan said, they were gentlemen scholars. They had some kind of separate income. They weren't being paid. Maybe they had a big estate already. They'd inherited a big estate or something like that. And you think, well, I say to my students, what could you do if you didn't need a job and you didn't have the internet? Think about all the things you could think about and you could get done with your time. And then it perhaps becomes a little bit easier to understand how people manage to branch out into so many different areas. And then I think the other big factor is and again, Nathan hinted at it, professionalization in general. So an example that I can give from my everyday life is, if I have a student who comes to see me and they say that they're in some kind of distress for some reason or another, right? Maybe they're self-harming or they're feeling suicidal or whatever. I'm under instruction then that the protocol is that I just write that down and then I make a referral, right? Because I'm not a qualified counsellor. So then where does it go? The student gets sent into the counselling matrix where they maybe wait 6 months for an appointment. They meet somebody who they've never met before. They meet them 6 times over the course of another 6 months, and they often come back and say it hasn't done anything or made any difference. Whereas maybe, you know, I've been teaching nearly 20 years. I've sat with people in those circumstances hundreds of times. I've known them for 2 or 3 years. I know their brother, I know their sister, I know their parents. But the whole of society says, yeah, but Dave, you shouldn't be the one talking to them because you don't have a piece of paper that says I am a qualified counsellor, right? Now, if I were to take 3 years out of my life and learn that stuff, then I could get that piece of paper. But we've slipped into this mindset that only an expert has any authority to say anything about that thing. And if you're not an expert and you can't prove you're an expert, you can't make any contribution. And so it's like a societal pressure. Society works against polymaths because if someone comes along and says, hey, I've got this really great idea about such and such, they say, well, that's not your field. Where's your qualification in that field? And they won't listen. So I think it's like it's a big structural societal problem that we've created ourselves, and the root cause of it often is money, because that way you guarantee yourself, if you say only the people who've got this certificate can do this job, then you secure yourself a job that might otherwise not be available to you. But how do you, the second part of the question was, how can you try and keep abreast of all of this stuff? Well, look, you can read some really good books. You know, if you were to read my book of Popes and Unicorns that I wrote with James Ungrianu, you're going to learn about history, philosophy, science. You know, it's going to theology. There are some really good books out there. My book is not the only good book out there, but you know, I better mention it, or Mrs. Hutchings will be annoyed that there are no book sales that come from this call. And yeah,
I'm going to declare an interest here. Mrs. B is a qualified counsellor and psychotherapist, and she would say, great, if you're great at listening skills, that's fine, but sometimes inexpert involvement can lead to harm. So I'm just going to put a little bit of a flag on that. So know where your limits are, I would say, when it comes to listening skills.
Right. Well, I think we're all really enjoying this. We are a bit extra time, but I think we'll allow one more question. And this was a question that actually came up earlier on in the day during your talk, Zachary. And so I think maybe if we start with what you think, and then branch out, because although it's related specifically to disinformation, I think you can apply it to all fields. I'll paraphrase it a bit. They've said, I was wondering whether you think a key reason people believe fake news is because it's telling them what they want to hear, and therefore clearly presenting the actual truth won't make much difference. Is there an alternative approach to combating disinformation, or are we called to resolutely keep telling the truth, regardless of how it is received?
Yeah, I mean, I think yes, and both. Like, we need to do both. Like, one reason we need to keep telling the truth is, at least in a public context, is other people are listening, and that's the value of social media. Is maybe we're having a conversation with someone and they're really unreasonable. That actually helps our case in the public square. So I'm happy to sometimes engage, you know, with say an atheist who I would think is being quite unreasonable, so a particularly antagonistic atheist. I'm okay to have a public engagement with them in some form of public debate or something, and that even if I don't suspect that they're currently open to to engaging or being persuaded, it's helpful for the public dialogue. I mean, so I think telling the truth has a value in and of itself. But sometimes people need the personal connection in order to trust us to listen to what we're saying. And so, yeah, I think we need both. We need to try and build personal connections with people who and help open them to persuasion in that way. And we also need to tell the truth, even if people aren't listening, because 2 years later, once the crisis of the pandemic has ended, people might go back to that and think, well, you know, I should have listened to that or whatever. So I think if we say it, it might get picked up on later as well.
Yeah, I suppose I would say we've got the ultimate example in Jesus, haven't we? He was a truth teller. He kept the message. What happened to him? He was killed, and at the time he was killed, he had a handful of followers, and it looked like the whole thing was an entirely pointless exercise. But it wasn't. So we keep going. We keep going, and we trust ourselves to the one who raised Jesus from the dead.
Off the back of that, Jesus was a truth teller, but he was also a really good listener. So he asked so many questions, and then he responded from where they were at. And I think we can just want to tell our piece without listening. And what I found helpful in my field, at least, is to listen and to learn, and then find where might be the easier commonalities from which to kind of springboard beyond that as well.
You know, interestingly, we were dealing with misinformation in the science communication course that I helped with at the uni on Tuesday. And I think, you know, what we came to the conclusion that sometimes we just have to accept that people aren't going to listen, but nevertheless, as you were saying, Zach, we just keep telling the, well, I guess it might even be what we see as the truth, but we just keep hanging in there and know where we stand on it.
I guess the only thing that I would add, because I think most people have said a lot of the relevant stuff, but for example, when it's come to COVID-19 and the vaccine rollout, I think in Africa, compared to, again, the Western world, there's been quite a big disparity. A large part of that disparity, you know, in Africa, many people have not uptaken the vaccine. And it's not because they're silly or because they just don't know any better, but there are real genuine social concerns for them, political concerns for them, which are actually making it so that they feel like they can't trust where these, let's say, vaccines are coming from. So if they're coming from parts of the world where they were formerly colonized, they remember stuff like that. It's not, that stuff isn't forgotten by them. And then they're being told again that they have to take this, otherwise certain things will happen. They're not sure if they can actually trust that, even if you're telling them the truth. And so, you know, I have no problem with the vaccine myself, and I think you should be able to take it. And I think that you should tell these groups to take the vaccines, but you also have to understand, and I think this is what Cara's pointed out actually, there's the truth element to it, but there's the social element to it, which is what Jesus was very good at doing. And so understanding them on both aspects, okay, tell the truth, but understand a bit more about where they're coming from. If in the end they're not able to accept it, then at least you've done your job. And again, Jesus Christ did exactly that at some point with the religious leaders. He gave it to them in, I can't remember exactly which Bible passage it is, but he kind of let them have it, and then he was kind of done with them, and they were also done with him. And that was essentially it, because he had, you know, previous interactions with them, and they weren't going to agree. And so that is, yes, again, Jesus is a very good model to kind of adopt in these situations, understanding to tell the truth, but also try to be better at understanding the social context in which this truth lies within.
Yeah.
Well, perhaps there's no better way to close that than Jesus is a pretty good model to base it everything off. Well, thank you so much to our speakers. I think everyone would agree that it's been a really fascinating day, and I'm sorry that you can't hear the round of applause that would be happening if we were in person, but yeah, it's been really great to have you all here. Just as we close the day, I've got a couple of things to share. There are a number of things also at Christians in Science that we have coming up that we'd love you all to know about. Firstly, we currently have a vacancy in our committee for a postgraduate rep. So we're looking for someone who is either a postgraduate student or perhaps is in that early careers phase, and they don't need to have any specific qualifications, but just generally a real passion to see conversation between science and faith. And as part of our committee, you'd get to be in our committee meetings, and you'd get to just basically help us and guide us where we could be best serving postgraduate individuals. Another thing to look out for is that our Oliver Barclay Lecture Award is currently open, and nominations for that close at the end of this month. The Oliver Barclay Lecture Award, if you're not aware of it, is a lectureship that we sponsor, and it's for a young and upcoming speaker. Zachary Ardern, who we've heard today, is our current holder, and Cara Parrett is also a previous winner. So it's a pretty good sign of what you could then go on to, or perhaps model off if you're interested. But I really do encourage you to apply, and don't belittle your qualifications. Just give it a go, and you never know, you could end up winning. And another thing more towards the summer is that we also run a student essay prize. And Nathan Bossoh, again, is a previous winner of this essay. So we're in esteemed alumni at the moment, but you can find on our website the details of both the Oliver Barclay Award and the Student Essay Prize, and also you can read and watch all previous lectures and essay winners. So I do encourage you to do that, and we'll share that in our email after this conference as well. But yeah, I'd really love to just close us in prayer as we go out to the day, and just to encourage you that after having so much laid onto us, so much good wisdom, it can be really difficult to feel like we've got to go and think about it right now and change our lives as a result. But let's be patient and to really go over what we've heard over time, and to learn to grow and to take to heart all that we've heard today. So Father God, we do just thank you for the blessing that it is that we have been able to come together, even here online. We thank you for that gift of technology to be able to do that. And we just praise you for these 5 speakers that you have raised up for us, and just equipped with just inspiring wisdom. And God, we do pray that you would help us to hear you in this. Help us, Lord, to take any sort of burning interests and passions that you've given us today, and to grow those in our hearts and minds, Lord. That, God, we would learn to live more for you in science and in the way that we interact with it. So, Lord, we pray as we come away from this day, would you continue to draw us to a place of wonder? Would you continue to remind us of all that we've learned? And would you help us, O Lord, to live for you? For the kingdom and glory is yours, Jesus. Amen. Amen. Well, thank you everyone for coming. We look forward to hearing your feedback, and your commute home is not long, so I'm glad for that. Thank you guys for coming, and we'll speak to you soon.